Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the PIDE webinar. We're going to start as usual on time. Let me begin by telling you that this is the third in our series of webinars on aid. So please mute your mics. Let the speaker speak first, then obviously everybody has a chance to speak. We begin with our usual slide to point out that how Pakistan is being chased by the dragon of IMF. And full disclosure, I used to work for the IMF, so before people start jumping down my throat. But yes, we are running on the chariot, or pulling the chariot of IMF, chasing loans over a very craggy landscape. And I think we seem to be in a flurry, in a crisis mode. We really don't know what we are doing. So that is always the preamble. That is a signature slide that we use. Now, this, as I said, is the third webinar on foreign aid to Pakistan. And today I'm very delighted that we are joined with by Masouda Bano, who's written this very nice book, which is called Breakdown: How Aid is Corroding Institutions for Collective Action in Pakistan. So Masouda Bano is a professor at Oxford, and she does other work too, but this is a very important book that she wrote a long time ago. She's young, so not a long time ago, but a while ago. And I think it's very good work. So that's why I was very keen to invite her. So with great difficulty, we tracked her and we've got her. And of course, we've got Javed Ahmed Malik Saab too, who's also a well-known economist, consultant, practitioner in Pakistan, written a book on agriculture and a well-known personality. So I think we'll have a very interesting session here today. We had two before this. You can see them written up in the slide below.
Yes, sir, your slide seems to be stuck, sir.
Slide is stuck again. Okay, we shall go back. Zoom doesn't do much for us these days because Pakistan has lost unfortunate connectivity. Okay, can you see the slide now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Let me see if I can start the show again and it works or not. If it doesn't work, give me a yell. Okay. A very short presentation because I want to go to the speakers first as always. They are the most important things. I'm just introducing, that's all. So another slide we show always is how many fund programs Pakistan has had. And as you can tell, Pakistan has had...
No, sir, your slides are stuck again, sorry.
Again stuck. Okay, let's go back to the simple thing then, okay? Very good. Okay. So another slide that we show always is how many programs, fund programs, which is the emergency ward of the international community. So as you can see, Pakistan has been in the emergency ward more often than not, and every decade of its existence. So that is a comment on us. What the comment is, I'll leave you to interpret, okay? And then we've got, where is it gone? Okay, then we go down to this. We did this on education. This is the number of policies we've had on education. We've had a policy every 5 years, which is also bizarre. And this is almost true in every area. So I want to remind you of that. But this is a very interesting slide that we have. This is from 1950, Pakistan Times 1950. And our ancestors were right. They figured it out. That's, I think, Liaquat Ali on crutches of aid. And there are the puppet masters at the back are saying, keep them addicted. Keep them addicted. Let them not grow up. And I think the people in the window were probably right. This is another slide we show always. Pakistan's long-term growth is declining. And the more of us who understand it, the better off we will be. We think we can build social safety nets. We think we can do IMF programs, but our growth rate is declining. So folks, we got to think about it. But unfortunately, thinking is not something that we do in Pakistan. But nevertheless, we've also got the lowest investment rate in the region, 15% of GDP, and declining, and never increased. That says a lot about us too. I'll leave you to draw the conclusions. We've also done a series of roundtables and webinars. We've tried to be as active as possible. PIDE must be idea generating and policy generating. So we thought about it. We've talked to a number of people. We consulted over, I think, 1,000 people. Everybody says that the biggest problem is policy inconsistency and poor policy development, especially tax policy. Everybody says transactions costs are very high in the economy. Everybody says our human resource management sucks. We throw out talent and we are run by a state mentality both in the private and the public sector. Everybody says that we have no market development, that we really need a deep deregulation and a clarity in our policies. Everybody says energy is a mess and cities are a mess. Cities are a mess too. So there are a number of messages that I can go through, but I won't because this is a webinar on aid. In the last 20, 30 years, almost everything we have done has been done by aid. When we unbundled energy, it was a consultant called ERG, contracted by the World Bank and USAID, who did that for us. They wrote the NEPRA law for us. The World Bank wrote the CCP law for us. Our tax policy was done by TARP, T-A-R-P, a tax reform project by the World Bank. Our civil service reform was done by the World Bank in 2005 to 7 when they sent so many civil servants to Harvard to study. Our public financial management law was written by Oxford Policy Management, a consulting firm for DFID. Debt law was written by another consultant, again contracted by DFID. SAP and NGOs, I think Masuda is going to talk about them too. Mortgage law has again, or mortgage company has been formed by donors again. Exim Bank has now been formed by donors. I could go on and on and on. So it seems almost all our policies are made outside the country. I don't know what we have. And I would refer you to the book by Dambisa Moyo, who also says that aid is now the new governance of the world, and the governments of the world respond to aid and not to local democracies. The local democracy is kind of a sham. So we got a huge amount of aid in place, and it's a very paternal aid. It's an aid that has mission oriented. When I was in the IMF, we used to go to countries on missions. We were on a mission to change the world. Who is accountable, who is responsible, I don't know. But most important of all, I think Masuda should talk about it. Who controls our thought industry, Masuda? Do we have our own? I mean, I was telling the HEC the other day, close down our universities and research. You don't need them because you got the aid consultants who will do everything for you. How do they learn? These people, if you ask today at this webinar, all our webinars, we've conducted 500 of them, not a single aid agency shows up. They seem to know everything from afar. They don't need to listen to us. This is, I think, going back to Lord Macaulay or something, right? Yet they make policy. So my questions to you people, the panel is it helping us? Is it transitory, or is it going to be there in my great-grandchildren's life too? Are we going to be permanently addicted to trade? What is it dependence? Does it erode or build our domestic institutions, or do they say that they build our capacity? Our capacity is being built for 70 years and we have not seen it being built. We have seen it come down. Can we outsource all our thinking? Does it crowd out our domestic thinking? Are our development contractors, Masuda, really that good? Is Oxford that good that it can manage our policy from afar? Is Duflo and Banerjee now in charge of the world? Is the advice that they're giving us really that good? I'll stop here. Over to you, Masuda. I'll take off my slides. If you want to share slides, up to you. Go ahead, Masuda.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting introduction and setting the scene very well, because I think what I'm going to present today is very much in line with the kind of concerns you have already raised. Now, let me see if I can get the screen, share the screen, because I'm not very good with these things. Let me just quickly see. Share. So I think you can see the slide right now. Is that right? Yes. All right. Dr. Haq, can I just ask one thing? How long, time duration wise, if I speak 30, 35 minutes, fine. Is that fine? Is it fine? So that we have some time for discussion. All right. So now my slides seem to be stuck too. No, it's fine. So It's fine. It's working now. So, which has already been very nicely done in the introduction given by Dr. Nadeem al-Haq, I'll go straight and dive into it, which is this, that I'm going to talk more about what happens when aid comes through what is seen as a non-state sector. Because I think in the preceding sessions, the dominant route, which is the state partnerships and the money that comes through these World Bank, multilateral institutions, or IMF, I assume they've been discussed. So the other channel through which a lot of development money comes today is through what we call very commonly NGOs, but the sector is broader. You can have multiple actors within it. So let's, at the beginning at least, call it the non-state sector. And what we know is that, again, these figures are not 100% necessarily up to date, but the most recent I have access to are the ones which show that 30% of the development aid does go through NGOs, non-state actors. So it's a reasonable share of the overall development money. So to give you a bit of history of why development agencies justify working through non-state actors, I'll give you a bit of history before moving into evidence of what do we see the impact of it in Pakistan and more globally. And the thing is that if you look at it, development agencies, even the multilateral ones, bilateral ones, have to work through a mandate. A government has to allow you to come in. So the first question is why? What gives the legitimacy for development agencies to work through non-state actors? Where again, they have to go through some government protocol, but it's not directly the government. They're working through non-state actors, which can raise potentially a lot of issues about accountability and who they work with. So what gives that legitimacy? So basically what we know in the literature is that it's starting from 1980s onwards, early 1980 onwards, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the others included in it, started talking about the need to work with the civil society. The argument was initially a lot of technical kind of arguments were given. The justification was built that the states are very corrupt in most post-colonial states, and that we need to go beyond the state, find more committed actors within these countries and work with them. There was also some evidence by then coming on some of the more successful civil society initiatives that if you work through the NGOs and non-governmental organizations, because they are community driven, the assumption is they are led by devout, committed leaders. So they're more innovative. They work with the community, they come up with local solution, they're often low cost. I'll give you examples later on, but I'm just trying to set the scene right now. And they're committed to the poor. So, they overcome the classic challenges that we see with the corrupt state in these developing countries. So let's work through them. So that was the argument built. However, by early 1990s, you can see in the World Bank and other development agency reports that there's a recognition, because there was enough research by mid-1990s to show that a lot of these assumptions associated with NGOs and their ability to deliver cost-effective, low-cost models were proving wrong on the field, in the field. And in fact, one of the very quick references I remember, because it's still a useful reference, is Edward N. Hume's book on Beyond the Magic Bullet, which was already out by 1995, bringing papers from a conference together, where there was a lot of evidence that NGOs are not as cost effective as assumed. They're very donor dependent in most developing countries. They become an elite in themselves, again, because of donor funding. And that their scaling up is very difficult. So even if a model sort of works, it works on small scale, a pilot, and it never goes beyond a pilot. So what's the use? So it's in this duration that donors come up with another justification for funding NGOs. So rather than the efficiency or cost effectiveness argument, they start making a more substantial, qualitative kind of argument, which is this, that NGOs reflect civil society, and civil society per se is good. So as opposed to just like delivery of service, now the scope of NGOs was being expanded, and they were being, the assumption was, this strengthens civil society, which civil society in turn strengthens democracy. So you strengthen democratic institutions by funding NGOs. Now that's a very bigger claim, even bigger claim to have, because in the first claim, efficiency argument, the claim is that they are a means to an end. You know, you have them because they give you some good efficiency and outcomes, which states are failing to deliver: good schools, efficient sanitation facilities locally, those kind of things. But in the second argument, the assumption is they are good in, they are end in themselves. Basically, that even if they don't deliver services, just having them is good because they bring people together and they strengthen the democratic system. Now, this is the background. I've tried to give you the justification donors classically used. However, what I'm going to focus on today is in showing that how both of these assumptions have proven very flawed, and NGOs have become a very donor-funded institution, where there are major issues of accountability domestically, and whose agenda they are promoting. But even more importantly, even the question that Dr. Haq mentioned, that they also control the think tanks. A lot of funding that's coming through the NGOs is dictating the kind of research that is happening in these developing countries, not just in Pakistan. So as a result, which ideas are being promoted themselves becomes very accountable to the Western funders rather than what the state or the society might really need. But let's go step by step. So basically, just to sort of build on the civil society argument, I'll just introduce quickly two references, since I assume that students who might find some of these references useful. Is this that traditionally civil society is a very dense concept. Many Western thinkers over the centuries have written about it, but the kind of conception of civil society that the donors use to fund NGOs is a very sort of simple one, which comes more from Tocqueville and more recently from Robert Putnam's, who's at Harvard, his work on social capital. So this is kind of work which says that civil society is good because it brings people together. I mean, there are much more complex Gramsci models of civil society, conceptions of civil society. We won't go into that. We are interested in how the donors have framed it. And the donors have framed it in a very simple terms of civil society is good because it's sort of people get together. So people coming together is very important, because like Tocqueville in his travels in America credited civil society for American democracy, saying because America has a lot of associational culture. They have associations which at local level, community level, everywhere, people come together, they form leadership skills while leading these organizations, which then translate into democratic lobbying and democratic skills. So this is one text they've used. The second is, like I say, is Robert Putnam. And in fact, if you look at the 1990s debate, a lot of literature, even in development studies on NGOs, was framed with the social capital concept, which again is very focused on associations. People people coming together, the energy they form together is useful. Volunteers are good, that's what brings the society vibrant and leads to development outcomes. So it's that kind of argument that's built a lot. However, and now I'll come to the evidence and a lot of it, my own work, which I'll draw a lot from Pakistan. But first of all, the literature, I'll refer to literature evidence from other countries as well, developing countries. And it's very sort of similarly pessimistic, all the evidence that we have of the concerns that are coming out of NGOs' over-dependence on donors. There are many sort of concerns. So first of all, what we are finding is that this whole assumption that donors can promote civil society is highly flawed, because donors, what they do is, the reason I mentioned to you Putnam and Tocqueville's work is just that all along the focus is on bringing people together, building trust. When people come together, they have trust, they share skills, they do something collectively. The donor money, on the other hand, has done something very different. What it has done is this 30% of aid that has gone through NGOs has ended up creating these professional organizations which become very heavily dependent on large sums of millions of dollars of donor money. And the salaries of the senior management, the ground staff, everybody gets tied to that donor money. And then also what we see is that like big offices, all of those kind of structures start occupying a lot of, consuming a lot of that donor money. And what reaches actually to the community is quite questionable. And more importantly, what we see repeatedly in this process is that, I'll give you a specific example from my own work, but even in other developing countries, what we are seeing is that because donors get very heavy, these NGOs get very heavily reliant on these donors. So first of all, the kind of work they do is entirely or largely framed by what the donors are sort of asking them to do. But secondly, because they are reliant on the donor sort of cycles of money, which at maximum, even the biggest donor funded grant cycle for an NGO would be, the largest generous one would be 5 to 6 years. So what you see is that beyond those 5 to 6 years, the organization has to move. So there's no sustainability, continuity of the intervention, which, as I'll argue from the evidence I have, is very important. You cannot have long-term systematic change in a society or a development reform without it being sustained for a decade or two. That's what we are finding repeatedly in different contexts. And NGO, in donor-funded NGO kind of work, just doesn't have that kind of sustainability, long-term sustainability. So let me give you some now specific examples. I did the book that Dr. Nadeem Al-Haq has kindly sort of shared with you, one of my first books. It gives you, this survey data, but it also gives you other evidence, but I'll focus on one of the surveys that I did for it. And this one was, I focused on NGOs. I defined NGOs narrowly as those which are heavily reliant on donor money, vested donor money. And I compare them with what I call voluntary organizations, which in my view were organizations like PIDE, organizations which have worked for a long time in Pakistan, but are locally funded. They raise local contribution and they have local volunteers. So the argument was that I wanted to see that because one is largely donor funded, do we see that one is better at mobilizing social capital, like local funding, local volunteers. So one aspect I compared between the two was the ability to mobilize local volunteers and members. Another thing I looked at with them was that also I wanted to compare that the kind of work they do and the sustainability of that work. Does it vary depending on whether they're NGOs like donor funded or locally funded? And also thirdly, I also looked at that, is it that NGOs do more development? Because a classic justification that donors use is that, oh, NGOs do development. You might have these voluntary organizations, but they just do charity, you know? So they might open an orphan school, but that's all they do. The traditional voluntary organizations like PIDE and all. While NGOs do some very sort of refined development, you know, focused work. They use a language of development. So what I show you in that survey, and like the book is there, but it's also an article in World Development that came in 2008, and like this particular survey results, is this that there's a very clear correlation between organization, all the big NGOs, and I don't want to take names, but I included the biggest NGOs you can think of in Pakistan, 20 of them across the country, and some of the biggest VOs. So VOs, because the NGOs come out a bit bad, that's why I'm not taking a name of any NGO, one NGO, but the VOs, voluntary organization, I'm giving examples like PIDE was there was sort of Al-Shifa Trust, you know, a lot of these organizations which rely on, or Cancer, Shaukat Khanum Cancer Hospital, all of these are voluntary organizations which are mobilizing local resources. And what I show you is that NGOs across the board, the largest NGOs you can think of, if you name them, they could not show you any voluntary members. So all they had was their paid staff, and that the ability to mobilize what Putnam has and Tocqueville were concerned with, this voluntary collaboration was non-existent. So, and also what you you see is that they don't have their ability to fundraise locally is very limited as compared to voluntary organizations like PIDE, which or Cancer Hospital, which generate a lot of funds locally. But these NGOs, donor-funded ones, very rarely show you the ability to mobilize locally. And secondly, this argument that they do different things, and that's why NGOs are, you know, better at development somehow. There's no evidence for that I could find, because eventually they might choose, when they talk to you, they might choose the language of development. So the voluntary organization might be running a school and not telling you about the words like empowerment or, you know, community, like a more sort of formal development language, but in terms of what was happening in the school was very similar. If the two are doing education intervention, the kind of education they were given were very similar. So there's sort of that kind of evidence that I share, that there's no evidence that because NGOs are donor funded and donor reliant, they do better development than what voluntary organizations do. While voluntary organizations, on the other hand, are locally responsible, they respond to local needs, and they're locally funded, and they have local volunteers. So this whole concern that Dr. Haq has in some way raised, that do we always have to be reliant on the outsider? the existence of these views show that that you always had this rich tradition of voluntary association and help and culture, but it's just that it's been overshadowed now by these big NGOs which come with big foreign money and overshadow the whole policy debate just because they know the language and they're funded by big donors and they can have conferences in the big hotels. They have taken over the voluntary sort of kind of sector. Secondly, just to cover another point is this one, this was more about the NGOs, but what about since then, because donor, and I'm giving you evidence from Pakistan, but across, there's a lot of NGO literature right now in different countries raising similar concerns. So of course, the donors cannot ignore all that literature because they continue to fund NGOs despite all these established concerns. So why, so in response to those concerns, because they still want to fund NGOs, primarily because through the NGOs, they get to advance their own agenda in that society, their own concept of, say, whether it's they invest a lot in gender empowerment work because they want to promote a certain kind of Western conception of feminism. I do a lot of work on Islamic conception of feminism, but no funder would ever, Western funder would ever do that, fund that kind of a notion, an organization trying to promote empowerment, but through an Islamic conception, which could be an equally empowering, I would argue, but have a different conception of gender norms than the West promotes. But of course, Western funders are very keen to fund feminist debates in developing countries, including Pakistan, and fund big NGOs in that area because they want to promote their vision of Western and of feminist empowerment. So of course, this is a very simple concern, but it's a big, it's a big example to show that how money comes through the NGOs to control certain agendas, to promote certain kind of languages or certain kinds of ways of living. So all of that is there. So knowing that there is a lot of critique of this, donors are now have started promoting a lot in the last 10 years, like 2000 period, collaboration. So they're saying, oh, fine, NGOs cannot scale up. They have this problem and of sustainability, this and that. So let's make them partner with NGOs because with states, sorry, because then they can bring the innovation and the states can help implement it at a large scale. And again, there's a lot of problem of motivation there because as we are again has been mentioned in the introduction, we have had a lot of donor funding even through the state system over these decades, and unfortunately the impact haven't been very visible, the positive impact. So we are seeing the same here. A lot of these collaborations don't really lead to, because even the state bureaucrats are cooperating for the time that the donor is giving some kind of incentives, financial incentives. There could be per diems in conferences. There could be vehicles given to the offices, government offices, or computers given. So they collaborate for that period because they get that. The NGO also gets their funding and their project, and the two sides work. But as soon as that funding goes, that kind of collaboration disappears. And I don't want to sound so cynical or demoting, like negative of the motivation of all these actors, but the truth is that there's just no evidence that they carry on beyond the time those financial incentives were offered. And here I'll mention to a more recent study beyond the book, which was done. I did it with a team of researchers this is more like last 6-7 years, which is just that we were looking at some of the most successful collaborations, state and non-state actors, it was not just Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. And I'll give you an example from Pakistan. And we were looking at, okay, fine, there's a lot of, we know NGOs don't deliver well, there's a lot of problem, but let's look at some of the best NGOs we have in education, health, and sanitation, 3 sectors, and see how they collaborate with the state. And here I will give example of I'll take the name of these NGOs because they don't come out bad, and I picked them up because I thought they were good. So one is ITA, Bela Jamil, everybody would know in Pakistan, who has done a lot of work on education. So for education, I took their NGO. Then after all, it's doing good work. Let's see how much they can impact the government when they work together. How sustainable is their work? What's the impact? Within sanitation, we took a Rangi pilot project up by Akhtar Hamid Khan in Karachi. And third one, health, we looked at again, you people might be familiar with this, that PRSP was given these basic health units in Pakistan to take over, and supposedly they delivered very well. So again, I don't have the time to give the details of that study. I can share them in question answer if anybody is interested. We picked these 3 because all 3 were apparently successful. But actually, the point I want to highlight right now is that eventually, out of the 3, the only one that can be called meaningful collaboration, long-term collaboration.
So that just to check, are your slides supposed to be moving? Because you're stuck at the first one, I think, the evidence slide.
The evidence. Actually, I'm covering bullet points. So this is one of the big slides. I won't be taking too many slides because basically I'm point 3 here. So sorry for that. I didn't split them. I just put them here. So, the biggest sort of what we have is out of the three, the one which was really successful is the Orangi pilot project. And anybody who knows Orangi pilot project knows that it's not a classic NGO. It's more of a people think of it as an NGO, but it's really a very traditional kind of voluntary organization where Akhtar Hamid Khan lived by very sort of different norms. He was very cautious of the kind of donor money he might engage with. He didn't want to become the organization to become dependent on donor money. He lived a very simple life. The organization itself is located in a very simple like a Rangi area, which is very undeveloped area and is very community embedded. While ITA and the PRSP model, the basic health unit model, they were also more effective for improving the outcomes for the time they were involved through that some kind of donor funding. But as soon as that money disappeared, the project sort of winded down, and there was no long-term sustainability of that. So basically what this example shows is that, again, you need, in order for to have long-term community development projects, one thing is that the state develops. The other development thing is state is failing, so community does something, self-help efforts. The organizations that can deliver are the Rangi style, and it's not the ones who become very heavily tied with donor projects and then jump from one project to another and in the process have no sustainability. And here I would just, before I move to the other side, one last thing I'll also share is that we have, we also have the other examples I can give you, but I'm saving time for discussion, so I might bring them up in the question answer session. Is this a localizing development, a World Bank a thick study done by World Bank by Mansouri and Rao. I mean, it's not a report, it's a book authored by them, but through World Bank, published through World Bank. Also acknowledges the same evidence, what they call organic participation, which is the kind of voluntary organization I'm talking to you about, or the kind of features that Orangi had to its work, is the only one which they show has long-term development impact on development outcomes, community level improvements in social service delivery. Induced, what they call, as opposed to organic, the induced participation, which is induced often by donor funding and all of that, fails to deliver any of these, long-term development outcomes. So the question I want to now raise with you, and I want to bring you back to some of the conceptual literature here, is this, that why do we see aid having this kind of impact on NGOs? And here the issue is that I think we have to conceptually look at the issue, and then the puzzle is not that difficult. And the puzzle is that in the political science and all, we have a literature which is very well developed literature on what we call the logic of collective action, or the prisoner's dilemma. I mean, which comes more from economics, politics and economics, these kind of debates. But these are the theoretical frameworks which are very powerful for understanding why aid has this negative impact. Because they make you focus on understanding individual rational behavior. I mean, these models are framed within that behavior. So they argue that people have to be incentivized to do, if you want to take part in a collective action kind of issue, you have to have some incentive to do that. And here, again, there are different kind of Hardin's Tragedy of Commons. Anybody who's interested, I'm giving you references, you should read them. They're classics. They're more like 1970s, 80s kind of literature. But that's still conceptually very relevant in my argument to understand the dilemma. Also, the logic of collective action, prisoner's dilemma, and the notion of free rider. Like all these things, these concepts, basically they help you sort of understand that you need to understand why people, as opposed to just giving money, donor coming in and saying, oh, let's have these NGOs, and they're altruistic, they are led by devoted leaders, and they'll do the great work. You need to understand that even the leaders of these movements are motivated by some factors, like why, which make them want to lead the organization, which make them want to do a good work. And what in my own work, I want to argue, I might go back to the other slide, but what I've ended up arguing is that aid actually ends up having a very negative impact on the motivation of the leaders of these organizations. As opposed to because if you look at all these voluntary organizations, when you do in-depth interviews, which I've done with all of them, or even you read work of authors like Gandhi, who have written about their own motivation, why they do this kind of voluntary work, is that they always would either give you some religious aspirations, in a country like Pakistan, if you interview the others, they'll mostly tell you, or my religion asks me to do that. So I do it for religious reason. I'll get my rewards in the other world. Similarly, but it's not just the religious organization. I also interviewed some Marxist kind of organization and the leaders of those organizations who don't take aid. And the argument was the same. They do it for an inner, some kind of altruistic motivation, because they feel, politically empowered in their own mind when they do something which they are committed to, instead of some kind of donor money coming in to do it. So conceptually in psychology, we have this literature which is which talks about motivation, and it draws a difference between two types of motivation. One is called intrinsic motivation, and the other is called extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is one which is motivated by money. So most of us do a lot of things for money, for financial incentives, all of that. While intrinsic motivation is the kind of motivation I was talking to you about, your religious devotion, which you do it for things that you don't do for material incentive, but they have an inner compulsion. Because you're religiously devout, or you are a Marxist, you really want to believe in certain ideologies, they motivate you to do that work, or that you are sort of altruistically driven and you want to do some good. So what aid, and interestingly, the point I want to conceptually raise is that this literature also tells you that there's an inverse relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So the more you move towards material incentives, the more your intrinsic motivation to do the same activity goes down. And this is what I argue happens with development aid, even when it comes to NGOs, because we have evidence, and I give you the evidence in the book, in the book that was mentioned in my book, in one of the chapters, where I give you example from Oxfam giving money to some local NGOs not local NGOs, CBOs, local community voluntary organizations in 1980s to 1990s to help them expand their work. But instead of expanding their work, they ended up fighting with each other once the money came in. And what you see happening there is that the more I did fieldwork around those organizations, was that as soon as money came in, the motivation of the leader started changing. Before, he was doing it for the love of God, or for some recognition in the community, or some kind of inner motivation. I mean, recognition in the community is not like that, but it was something he was trying to do from an inner compulsion. When the donor money started coming in, incentive changed. Once you are doing it because somebody is paying you money, your salary to do that work, you could no longer claim the inner psychological well-being or the religious sort of rewards you were to gain through that. So slowly the inner motivation erodes, and what ends up being is that, oh, it's money, you have to do this work because this donor wants you to do this work, and then infights start. We saw in those organizations, because as soon as before people came to you, gave you money or volunteered for you, because they thought you were devoted, to the cause. And they could see that because you were investing your time, you were investing your money, energy, and you were committed. Now they could see that you are getting money, you're getting cars, you're getting big offices, you're going to conferences. All these issues are raised in my fieldwork by the community. Why should we trust you that you are committed anymore? You give us no signals, what we call signaling theory. Community gets no signals of commitment of this leader who's so NGO donor funded, and then cooperation breaks down. So basically, I think I can finish with this. Oh, sorry, this is loud. I didn't realize that. Is this that for me, the main conceptual framing, therefore, and even in this book, has been all along that we need to, in order to understand why aid has this negative impact and that it can never be good for strengthening local civil society, is this that we need to understand the motivation of the initiators, those who lead organizations, and the joiners, because together they form a collective group that does some kind of social good. And those motivations get completely distorted when the initiators become very heavily reliant on material incentives, and that's what donors give. They give you material incentives, and the inner commitment erodes. So what you need is, if you want a strengthened civil society, you need local organization, which was the case prior to 1970s when this donor money started coming in. There was a culture of voluntary organization, which still exists, but now is sidelined by these bigger sort of money-heavy NGOs. So we need to promote that. And secondly, I think we need to, and here I'm thinking back again of the research think tanks, and because again, Dr. Haq raised the issue of is our, even research side producing the kind of work we need, or is it all externally driven? And I think it's a big pity. I mean, again, in a short conversation, of course, if somebody from STPI is sitting there, or, any of these Aurath Foundation, they'll say, oh, I'm so extreme, I'm labeling all of it as negative. I can see the nuances. They might do some good somewhere, a report somewhere, this and that. But the issue is that they cannot deny that the bigger agendas today are set by what's the big money consultancy that's coming. Who is going to tell them what to research, how to research, and what kind of report to deliver. So when the best of your researchers in country are catering to this external funded research agenda, there's no time and energy left with them to really focus on what their country really needs. So these fundamental issues are not just in Pakistan. We are seeing it, this is a recognition in the literature of aid having this negative framework globally, like in developing countries globally. Some individual reports could be useful here and there, but I don't think you can have a strong public-led agenda, research, or civil society, as long as you say so reliant on development aid. So I'll finish with that. It's already taken a lot. I hope Javed can come in, whose work I really like, frankly, every time I talk to him. So I'm looking forward to listening to him. But I hand it back to you, Dr. Nadeem.
Thank you very much, Masuda. That is a very good, lively summary, very brief summary of your book. I would urge everybody to read it. It's a very informative, very good book. And I think your conclusions, I certainly am fascinated by them. And certainly the issue of incentives that you raise hits home to an economist like me. And that's where I take off from, that in fact, did we really get independence or did they con us? Did they really decide that, like a little child, leave them alone, but we'll control them from the distant lands through our consultants, through our agents? You talked about voluntary organizations. We'll talk a lot more about that. But let me just ask Javed sir. Javed sir, where do you stand? Did we get independence?
Thank you very much, Dr. Nadeem. I think we did. And one of the reasons why we work very well with the international community is because if you remember, 1870, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, he sold his house, went to Cambridge University, took notes in Urdu, that's how universities work, like came back, established institution, asked the colonial rulers to give a piece of land, delivered a university, that delivered Muslim League in 1906, and that delivered a state in 1947. So, I mean, it's for us to work with the international community is pretty much part of our history, and we should shy away from it. You remember Jinnah also. He was member of parliament elected in 1904 until 1947. In 50 years, he engaged throughout. One of the most orthodox ones, like Iqbal, was part of the first round table, second round table. Muhammad Ali Johar, I can keep on. So my point is that it's very much part of our tradition and culture to work with a very pluralistic and international global community, find allies. And we never had this BJP type mentality where we start kind of accusing the entire world for what they are trying to do with us. It's a different culture and it's part of our tradition. So, I mean, I am never shy of actually seeking help and learning from others and working. So I think that's the starting point. I think I would approach this from a slightly different standpoint, that what problem we are really trying to solve. The problem we're trying to solve collectively is the underdevelopment of our country. And then we should look at what is it which is causing it. Is it international aid? Or is it the weak implementation capacity of the state? And I mean, it's the second thing which, I mean, because I worked for roughly 9-10 years in grassroots organizations, roughly in 500 villages. And then the next 10 years, I worked with the Chief Secretary, Finance Secretary, Chief Ministers in Punjab Education Sector Reform with the PIDE. So, I mean, I have both of these standpoints, and I can very easily tell you that the delivery chain from the office of the Chief Minister down to the facility level is broken. And now I work with the politicians all the time. Even the best of the politicians are not able to deliver their manifestos because you have a very, very weak implementation capacity. And I mean, you have shared a slide with us where you have 13, 14 education policies. We are not bad in making policies. We're bad in actually delivering those policies. I think that's the starting point. And that's what we are trying to really solve. And I think if you look at the overall aid portfolio, annually, even when in the best of times in Punjab, for example, when in the education sector reform, bank and DFID, I mean, I was running the largest education program of DFID in the world. And even then, the entire World Bank's and our share in the total education budget was roughly 8 to 9%. So, I mean, in no way international donors can actually control your policy making and deliver it. It's actually a collaborative effort in which you bring to the table technical ability and technical capacity, and together you try to kind of do few things. From where it becomes really crucial, the problem is the way your budget is structured. In all of these sectors, you have 80, 85 or 90% of the budget in your own sectors, they actually is allocated to salaries. And then you're left with like only 10% of the amount with the line departments. And if they like, for example, your work or Dr. Masouda's work, they can't actually hire you. The procurement rules don't allow that. That's where, for example, if a secretary in D&D says, okay, I'm very interested in kind of, re-looking at the aid portfolio in Pakistan, can you actually come and work with me? It's very difficult for him to hire somebody. So international partners kind of bring in this additional capacity and as well as initial procurement system in which you are able to bring in some capacity locally or internationally, which actually then allow them to really work. From the standpoint of delivery, and I'll come to Masouda's point also, but from the standpoint of delivery, which is actually very important point, because the reason why NGOs and international donors came in is the basic rationale is that your policies are not able to make an impact on ground, and that's why there's a case for kind of having these international bodies who are coming in, and then that's why it's important to spend some time on it.
Javed Sahab, here I must come in here because I think we really need to clarify one thing. Are we just monkeys who must ape what is told us, or can we think? The suggestion that you're making, which is very important to bear in mind, is that all policies come from the West and we are only implementers, and our failure is because we fail to implement. My question is donor advice very good? Are you telling me all donor advice is excellent, and if we followed it, we developed? Then tell me what happened with all the advice that they've given, and their own project evaluation says it was bad advice.
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that we should take responsibility to deliver our own development, and we didn't really reform our civil services, or we didn't put in place institutions which actually are able to kind of really frame policies and then design them. I mean, you look at the capacity of planning commission, the way it's eroded over time, our PND and others. Why? I mean, it's our responsibility as Pakistani citizens, our Pakistani electorate, or Pakistani political parties. It's our responsibility to make sure that our parliamentary committees work well, our planning commissions work well, our PND department, the provinces work well. That's what I'm saying. But what I'm also saying is that, if you go to the next level, in which, for example, if you put in place a policy, I mean, you have taken the case of education, then to deliver that is actually a great challenge. And that delivery capacity in your own structures is pretty limited. And that's really a big problem. And the reason is you have to have roughly 6 ducks in line to deliver a successful policy. You have to have political intent, you need to have a policy in place, then you need to have money in place. But most importantly, you need to have the ability to convert that money into successful programs. And that's a real problem in which most of your institutions, locally health or education for that matter, where I worked actually most of the time, it's actually very difficult to really convert the intent of political party into successful programs. Now, if you take the case of Punjab, for example, the history of education reforms, the story is very different from 2002 onward and before. After 2002, when, for example, Punjab government, they came up with Punjab Education Sector Reform Program, learning from India's program, other programs, and then the bank was involved in. Roughly 6 to 7 new institutions were developed, which now have the number of children have doubled, the learning levels have gone up, the facilities have gone up. The qualification of the teachers have gone up. I mean, and then the key institutions like Punjab Education Foundation, PMIU, others, they're all established because you had this kind of learning from international best practices. You had ability to kind of then evolve those. Now you pick the Balochistan province, for example, where we have only local, for example, expertise were there and local, and they couldn't do it. And the reason is that your own structures and the bureaucracy doesn't have that ability to really develop these institutions. And that's a big problem. For example, institutions like Punjab Education Foundation, where you have now 3 million children study through public-private model, has become really a model for developing countries for improved access and quality at a very, very low cost. And you could only do that because you were able to learn from other developing countries, places like Chile, other places, which actually most of the international community was able to work with developers to develop it. So, I mean, this is very important that in the real sense where you want to have indigenous capacity, indigenous delivery, whether you have those capacities in your system or not. Now, the second point of voluntary action, which Dr. Masuda talked about, I agree with your broad point, but I think the second point is that, for example, where it comes to practicing participation in professional manner, the welfare center organization really didn't have that particular professional lens, and that's why you had to have rural support network, rural support other networks, and they were able to practice participation at large scale level. You have access to finance program, other programs. And why you have to have these programs? The reason is your political parties don't like local governments at all. I mean, most local governments came from military dictators. Most elected governments, unfortunately, couldn't really come up with the local government structures. Today is an important day to talk about that because yesterday, 31st August, Sindh was the last government to have any form of elected governments. Now, even that province doesn't have. Now in Pakistan, you don't have locally elected local governments. Now what happens, and I'll just finish in 2 minutes. What happens in that case, when you don't have local government structures in place, the state generally designed from colonial angle, and at the village level, the state is really absent. And I talk about that in my book also. Now, when the state is absent at village level or at a local level, then, for example, you citizens are not left with anything. The participation then doesn't happen on its own because welfare-focused organizations can only do a certain services. I mean, for example, a disability facility or a local. But when it comes to integrated development, you have to have a program in place where a local catalyst actually mobilize villages and others and kind of come up with some structure to deliver integrated development. And that's most of these rural support programs, which again, by the way, Government of Pakistan really facilitated, but again, it was developed on the basis of international best practices and some of the donors money supported it. So my essential point is, Dr. Nadeem, that, you know, we as a nation should be responsible to deliver our own development, but we shouldn't make international aid community as an enemy. For example, we were framing a wrong kind of, enemy here. What I'm saying is that the real root cause is that you got to reform the civil services, you got to kind of make sure parliamentary committees to have access to research, you develop the oversight capacity of the parliament, you put in place the local government, and you would then be able to kind of deliver the 90% of the aid budget, which you really do well. And so that's where we can pick up from and come back to the document again. Thank you.
Masuda, I'll come back to you and Javed Sahab both. Let me ask you a simple question. Javed Sahab says we should frame the questions such that they're not our enemy. We should be nice. We should play nice boys. We should play nice people, etc., etc. Yet, it is all right for the aid community to call us corrupt. Where is the evidence? The evidence is formed by Transparency International. And that, Masuda, I think you should know, at least I know, was funded by the World Bank, through a trust fund, through DFID and other aid places. Transparency International is as much a donor agency as anything else. Then again, think of all the NGOs that donor agencies have formed. Even places like, for example, IFPRI, like places, for example, Network for Global, whatever. There's so many of them that they've formed, which all gang up together to tell us that we are bad. The last World Bank report actually had sections in it saying how the military is bad. Yet we can't be critical of aid. I find that somewhat difficult to accept. Can we critique aid, Masuda? And is aid above Transparency International ranking? I've called Transparency and asked them, can you please rank aid? For example, have you studied the aid contracting process? Javed Sahab, you were a part of it. PIDE can't bid. Our universities can't bid in that process. Oxford Policy Management, ASI, Chemonics have a monopoly. They don't consult with anybody else. They only work with it. Is that clean? Masuda, first you, then Javed Sahab. Can you tell us whether this is a clean process?
No, I actually am with you because I don't agree. I mean, I generally like Javed's sort of viewpoints, and I really sort of we have a lot of useful discussions. But here we do differ because first of all, the fact that we can question it for sure, I would say for sure. Because and I'll give you one very simple example, which is this: that we all know that which I didn't go into at all because mine was a more focused agenda today, looking at how it impacts collective action. But we all know the politics of it, that what the governments choose to, which countries prioritized, why if it goes towards northern Nigeria and Pakistan when militancy is high there. It's a lot of political agenda rather than education and health being the criteria. So of course, which country to support, first of all, is a political agenda. But secondly, I myself was part of a research mission in the sense, because again it was a World Bank led education report we had to do, and me and 2-3 British consultants were in 2009 doing field work with all the donor agencies, looking at the gap sort of education program. And at that time it was very clear, all the informal meetings with the DFID staff, the British education officer in DFID or Norwegian offices and all, they were all very clear that right now our education priority, the budget we give to government on education, is subservient to getting access to security concerns. We want access to the military in the northern areas, all of that, in not northern areas, the tribal areas. So a lot of the donor money, which was apparently for education and all, was negotiated on basis on how much access you'll give us. So, Javed, there are some very fundamental issues. The kind of examples you gave us, historical ones, Jinnah going, that's a very different thing. I'm sitting in Oxford today, not because somebody has funded me to sit here, it's because fine intellectual ideas are there, I want to take them, but independently blend them in my way and bring them back to Pakistan. So I talk about Islamic feminism as opposed to Western feminism because I combine the two sides. I'm free to do that. When I do a consultancy report, which I do from time to time, I cannot talk about Islamic feminism because the terms are bound. So do you understand? There's a big difference. And Jinnah and all were engaging in the way I like to engage as an academic. As a consultant, you just don't have that freedom to give those kind of free ideas, because your parameters are set by the donor, what they want to get done. Secondly, also, I have a lot of issues here. When you give us these examples of all these successful, Punjab was successful, first of all, those evidence are very contested. I'd say like this Babar Ali, whatever his name was, not Babar Ali, what's the name, the British education consultant, which was used a lot in that period.
Michael Barber.
Michael Barber. Exactly. Some people say, oh, he did miracles in Punjab. The other ones also give you evidence saying it was all, a waste of money. So when you give us examples of some schools were improved, at what cost? I've been part of an advisor on a DFID program in northern Nigeria for 8 years, and I've seen like it was a £150 million project by the end of it. And in the end, when we were leaving, I did a very successful Islamic Quran school intervention there. But for the money that we put in, the results, did they match? No, because there was no long-term sustainability. And it's a very classic problem. Very good intentioned consultants also cannot achieve the state system, because the problem, as you say, lies at the state level. State has to fix themselves. And that's my biggest concern, that these donors come along and they cost a lot of opportunity cost to your civil servants, because they come up with their multiple competing ideas. They give them incentives. I saw that in Nigeria all the time. You give them incentives. The chief minister will come to your conference. You make them stay in the posh hotel, give him a 50,000 naira kind of per diem per night. He'll happily come. He'll endorse the policy for the time being. But then another donor will come, UNICEF will come on education and to lobby another policy. He'll go and do that too. And in the end, at the end of 5 years, a lot of money wasted on the donor part, but maybe it wasn't wasted. Maybe that's what they wanted, just a bit of clout in that period. While at the end of it, the state is at the same level, and the bureaucrat is even more confused because he has been chasing 10 different donors, not chasing, in fact, benefiting personally, but not at the state level. So, so there's a lot of opportunity cost you have to see of these donors coming in with the ideas and lobbying your civil servants and politicians to do things, rather than the state needs to look internally. What's the priority? How best they can fix it. And I don't think you need so many programs. That is the problem, in fact, because I think solutions to a lot of these problems are technically not that difficult. To run a good school eventually doesn't take miracles. Pratham example tells you it's a very simple one. Our own successful examples show that. It's just that you need to have a state commitment, and donors, in fact, take away that state commitment, then build it. That's my concern. So I leave it there. I mean, I understand. I fully understand. That's what I meant when people listen to me, especially those who work in the development sector or are used to it, will see the other side and say, oh no, we do some good, we do these useful programs, but in the bigger scheme of things, they don't pay off. That's my view. So I'll finish.
What's up?
No, I think the donors also have to respond. I mean, especially the procurement process in which local universities cannot bid, that should be reformed. Even actually, and EAD and others can make rules actually where, for example, they can make it conditional to aid that then only local firms could bid or local university could bid. I mean, that could be done and that should be done. And locally, the capacity people of, I mean, there's a lot of people who could actually work with that's a different thing. But my point is that, and this is again, I mean, framing this, the real problem is that,
Javed Sahab, since you are here, let me ask you. You worked with DFID. What is the average size of contract that firms like ASI, OPM, I don't want you to divulge any information, that's whatever. What is the average size of contracts delivered to firms like this?
I mean, 90% money still goes to the government. I mean, for example, the portfolio I was leading.
What is the average size of money that is allocated to these people? That's what I'd like to know. Because I hear they have, for example, I can tell you right now, ASI has a seed project, whatever seed is, in KPK worth 20 million pounds. There are so many projects that have, Chemonics, for example, has $100 million worth of project. One project for $100 million. No Pakistani university has even $2 million. So what are we talking about? How can we compete? You tell us that we should own ourselves and we should implement. How can we do that? If there is so much money, take for example another thing. Just now there's a project coming, Masouda. World Bank is doing a $125 million project on Pakistan going global, which is going to be consulting studies given to these firms. Now, how do we compete? Please tell us, Javed Sahab.
No, I mean, we were running sector budget support, Dr. Nadeem, and Dr. Nizam is also around because he's also like working in Punjab at that time. I mean, it's like 90% money actually goes to the government budget itself, and then government actually through their own budgetary support to various sectors, they allocate money, and then people like us work with government to make sure that this money actually travels well, allocated well, is monitored and evidence-based. And I completely agree with you that the privatization of aid which have happened in the last like 10, 15, 20 years, in which most of these international firms have started winning projects and coming to developing countries, that should be stopped. And Pakistani firms and Pakistani national institutions, as well as they should be able to kind of bid for this money. So, I mean, that is where we don't have any dispute.
Okay, fair enough. Let me bring you to this. Masouda, let me share this screen with you. I hate to advertise my own work, but I did this some time ago, 2-3 years ago. Mullah-led development. This appeared in many newspapers through Project Syndicate. And I took exactly what you're saying, Afia. I said, liberals like us are losing the battle because of exactly what you said. We run NGOs. We work on donor agendas. I get my per diem. I worked on a donor agenda. I print out a report. Donors read it. Hardly anybody reads it in Pakistan. But the mullah actually has voluntary associations that you are talking about. They have those voluntary organizations. The mullah is a social entrepreneur. He actually goes out, looks for masjid ka chanda or funding wherever he can. He gets no top-down agenda. He gets a bottom-up agenda. Exactly. So he is winning. We are losing. Would you agree?
I agree in the sense that, no, I agree fully with the analysis that that's where, what I don't know is what's his agenda. That's another thing I can comment. But the thing is that, yes, he's the one embedded in the community. He's the one who has trust. He's the one who's able to mobilize the people. And to be honest, the good ones among them do some good services for the community too, for sure. So no, I agree. That's the thing. Like, if you want community embeddedness, you have to be embedded in the community. It's the same thing with Orangi. Like, it is very embedded in the community. Historically was, but I think where Javed is coming in, he's just looking at bigger projects of different kind, where I'm still cynical, but do you understand? That's a slightly different kind of comparison.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks. No, I was the deputy chairman of the planning commission, so I know how things are done. And I can tell you honestly, the donors lead the agenda, we don't. But I'll go to Nizamuddin Saab, who is former vice chancellor, Gujarat University, ex-UN official, former chairman of Punjab Higher Education, now a chancellor of another university. Nizam Saab. Nizam Saab, unmute.
Thank you very much for giving me the chance. I really enjoyed the discussion, very open, very candid. I just wanted to clarify what alternative we have. I think voluntary organizations are not alternative. They are not there. And I think the Kurungi town was not a voluntary organization. It's a special arrangement by that time with the bank, BCCI Bank, and others funded them. But I think what we need to do, provide the donors an alternative structure that can implement. They are fed up with the government inefficiency because they don't implement on time. They don't give them the results. So I was sitting in the Chief Minister's office every month on the education agenda, which DFID was funding heavily for school projects. They were not funding university projects, but school projects. And they're using the Punjab Education Foundation, Punjab government departments, and McKinsey Group coming from Dubai to prepare the reports, evaluation reports for the Chief Minister, which actually with good plotting and diagram and description, then he was happy that we are doing very well. That kind of work would have been done by the government of India, but somehow it was being done by McKinsey Group. Question I have to ask, what are the alternatives we have available if you don't want to use the term NGO, although the NGOs and PBOs and NPOs are really interchangeably used in Pakistan, but you have very nicely distinguished between NGOs and PBOs and voluntary organizations. There are not many voluntary organizations without interest or profit interest or benefit interest. The madrasa-led, mullah-led, maybe, but they also have interest of their own. The mullahs have their own benefit also as well. So you can't take out the personal benefit or personal interest in the PVOs or voluntary organizations or NGOs. The distinction is, I think, is not very clear. It will be difficult to maintain.
Fair enough. Let me take Tahir Dhinsa now. I'll come back to you in a couple of questions. Tahir Dhinsa. Tahir साहब बोल रहे हैं कि नहीं? Unmute करें, unmute. Tahir साहब, there's something wrong with your system. Re-enter. Shafkat Abbasi साहब.
Assalamu alaikum. I am Shafkat Rasool. From International Relations, Namal University from. I have a question about financial aids linked with my field international relations. Okay, this is a basic alarm for the organization. They are waiting for aids. Basically, countries have lots of issues for their domestic issue, international issue. They are banned on the AIDS program. What do you think about United States of America ban on the WHO? This is a political issue but they are banned on the financial ban to WHO. What do you think about the future of AIDS and international relations, like increase of populism, nationalism? What do you think about it? Thank you so much.
I didn't quite get that. शफकत साहब जरा आप ठीक ऊंचा बोलेंगे, जरा बताइए फिर से, मुझे नहीं समझ आया. आपको समझ आ गई है मसूदा? चले
सर, दोबारा पूछ लें सर क्वेश्चन.
जरा अच्छी तरह स्लोली पूछें, स्लोली. शफकत साहब.
Different countries ban on the AIDS, no? Because there are different issues, the domestic and economical issues, like this pandemic issues. So many countries ban on the AIDS, like Donald Trump, WHO, he banned for the AIDS, WHO. What is the future of the AIDS?
Okay, what is the future of the aid industry? Okay, fair enough.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me go back to Masooda and Javed for answers to these questions. Go ahead, Ji. Javed sir, would you like to go first?
सर, जो शफकत जो मजमूई तौर पे दुनिया में एड इंडस्ट्री है वो तेजी से एक ऐसे दौर में गुजर रही है जहाँ लोग अपने जैसे एफसीओ और डिफिड के मर्जर से पता चलता है कि एक aid would be now more kind of prioritized on political basis. It used to be tacit, as Masooda mentioned, but now it's actually much open, and therefore this FCO and in USAID already the aid is merged in the Foreign Office. I mean, so most of the Foreign Offices, it have become tool of international foreign policy now for most of the countries. So therefore, that is one thing which is happening. The second trend is that aid architecture is changing also. So you have now these new foundations coming in, Bill Gates Foundation, other foundations, Facebook Foundation, they're actually way more stronger than these bilaterals also, and they are also coming up with their own models, and they are coming with more private sector approaches. So therefore, the reliance on community structures and the government structures now, they're coming up with a more different financing model, which I think actually takes a lot of time and doesn't really deliver much. But that's actually, this is the early time in which they're experimenting with these new aid modalities. NGOs का भी जो दौर है पाकिस्तान जैसे ममालिक में, अब तेजी से उसमें कमी आ रही है. मिसाल के तौर पर अब 19 लॉज हैं जो एनजीओस को गवर्न करते हैं, और 2015 के बाद पाकिस्तान में बेशुमार एनजीओस बंद हुए हैं. किसी भी एनजीओ को अब इंटरनेशनल मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ इंटीरियर से एमओयू के बगैर वो काम नहीं कर सकते. और जो चैरिटी कमीशंस बने हैं सूबों के अंदर, हर नई बैंक ट्रांजैक्शन के ऊपर भी अब एक तरह से डिफिकल्टी है. तो मेरा ख्याल है कि काफ़ी सूरत हाल ऐसी है जिसमें डॉक्टर नदीम जो पुश करते रहते हैं, हमें इटसेल्फ एक नया मुकाबले की तरफ बढ़ना होगा कि पाकिस्तान में जहाँ पे स्टेट स्ट्रक्चर रिफॉर्म जो है वो नहीं हो पा रहा और जो वॉलंटरी स्ट्रक्चर है वो हो रहे हैं, तो आप किस तरह से अपनी कि आप एक लम्हे के लिए इंटरनेशनल एड को भूल रहे हैं. आप ओवरऑल 90% बजट तो हमारे पास है ना, जो 92% हमारे पास हम करते हैं, कैसे हम उसको ऐसे खर्च करें कि हम अपने लोगों को ह्यूमन डेवलपमेंट इंडेक्स को जो है वो बढ़ा सके. तो ये हमारा एक कौमी सवाल है.
ठीक. Tahir Dinsa, you've come back. Do you want to say something before Masouda? Go ahead, Tahir. जल्दी बोलें ताहिर साहब. Tahir, you can't.
Unmute.
Okay.
Now, can you hear me?
हाँ, बोलिए बोलिए.
Very quickly, Masood Saab have just uttered a one sentence. It's an instrument of foreign policy. I think that is the reason, and I would want to get a response on that as well. And privately, I shared something. Just quick one example of one project. This CASA 1000 project was to import electricity power from Central Asia. You know, the electricity is produced as it is direct current, and that is transmitted as direct current for efficiency. The conversion point grid that would convert a DC into AC was planned in Kabul, not in Pakistan. And whole of the distribution network was designed for the area of FATA, where this organizations, these MNAs and PTM, they are working, and the issue of the Durand line was. And till very late, US was holding seminar and doing that. Now they, in papers only, they have changed, okay, that conversion station would be there. Then again, when on electricity, the World Bank and all the consultant was working to Bijli Pakistan ki, both issue air energy is the deficit. They were working on generation, and even a layman would know that the real issue is distribution and transmission. And from the day, I personally think that from the day one, it's the political connotation that it brings corruption. And grand example is that last word, that 20% of building this Indus water treaty dams and canals in Pakistan, India was made to pay that because Pakistan would enjoy a great influence in the West at that time. Now I think this NGOs would, when the aid would come to the new bloc, that is China and Eurasia or Shanghai Corporation, I think that would become all right. It will once again Light 60 contribute.
Fair point. Khurram Saab, quickly. Yeah, Khurram Saab, are you there? Okay, Khurram Saab is not there. So Masouda, I'll come back to you. Can you take those questions? Can you please also answer for me if you can? ये जो है सारी बात voluntary associations, NGOs की बात है. I mean, funding also determines what the NGO does. Take the NRSP, for example. You mentioned the PRSP. They were supposed to do rural development. They moved into microfinance, education, so many things. So as the funding changed, they changed. And we don't know whether what PRSP is now, whether it's cow, tiger, lion, whatever. It's just another agency, that NGO that absorbs funding. Now, is that good governance? Is that the way we should go? So our universities are dying, Masuda. Our universities, should we just let them die and let all policy be made by Oxford Policy Management, Adam Smith International, Cambridge Analytica? I mean, how should we operate? Go ahead, Masuda.
Yeah, exactly. So on this one, I'll take the last your comment first, and that's exactly the concern. Even at the very small level, that's what I was showing. It's the shifting, and that's where Javed, and I can see the angle he's coming from, where I'm raising the concern is this: that of course, if you look at a specific intervention in the given time frame, often you'll say, oh, something at least good came out of it. It wasn't all bad in that program. But the problem is that with this shifting priorities, that short-term kind of good doesn't lead to much. So so that is a genuine problem. We cannot sideline it, because it's mentioned all the time, but then set aside. Even that, okay, fine, there is this problem of shifting priorities with donor money and all, and PRSPs and all. Exactly, because otherwise, would they move into all these areas? Not necessarily. They might have prioritized one or two and done them well. But now, wherever if it comes in, oh, let's do this, a bit of microcredit as well. They do that. They do a bit of that, and then it's everywhere. And I have done a lot of fieldwork with all these different organizations over time, and there's just no way, or foundation or PRSP or any one of them can deny how their programs come to close when donor money closes and they shift to a new one. There's just no way around it. So anyway, that's the last one. I mean, that's about the last question. But just to go back, in general, I think with all this question about future of aid, Javed, I think, has addressed that good one. I don't have much more to add to it, because yes, modalities are changing. New, like even these Bill Gates and all are coming in. The foreign office kind of stamp is becoming more obvious, even in the UK. US, it was always very foreign office labeled, but now even DFID is getting a more explicit foreign office label. So all these things are happening. And I agree also that NGOs are getting more tightly sort of controlled in Pakistan. But again, I don't know whether all this regulation, that's overboard too. Maybe you don't need so many regulation. You want to encourage local participation. If you do have so many laws restricting everything, people might not even form any kind of voluntary organization, because getting paperwork becomes so difficult. So I think we have to be a bit careful about the paperwork that's developing around NGO, because I'm not concerned that much about NGOs, but voluntary organizations are regulated by the same law. So you should not stifle them by making regulations so tough. But international money coming into NGOs should be fair enough, fairly regulated. And if that's happening, that's okay. And I think the first question about, I think the other example about the electricity grid and all was more an example endorsing something I'd said, which is that donors go in with their political agenda. So I think I don't have much to add to that. I'll only respond to the first question, which was explicitly about the definition of NGOs and VOs and all. See, I agree with this, the way you are thinking, you or even Javed made this comment that, oh, but VOs do different kind of work, that they might not come up with this posh PRSP kind of network labels, all of that. But the thing is that for the objective they set out, they normally deliver it well, and they can mobilize local money. It might be zakat money, all of that money, but pots of money exist in different form of way in locally, and you also have a lot of voluntary capacity. You are a human youth, a bulging youth population. If you mobilize them effectively, you can get a lot of volunteers, a free manpower in to do things, and you build the capacity in the process too. So I think you have to start thinking a bit imaginatively. Gandhi did not wait for like we associate the most strongest form of community, a networked, integrated kind of community development model, holistic one, with Gandhi, and he was not waiting for donor money to do it. It was very localized indigenous model, just like Rangi. You might not call it VO, but it's for sure not a standard NGO. It's registered as a voluntary organization, and of course it got money from what this bank we had, BACCI or whatever. And I'm not against that money, but that money is not the same as a Western Development Agency money. You have big philanthropists, you should take money from them, whether they are banks or whatever. That's legitimate money, because there you normally control the agenda. We are talking about agenda of development agencies which are tied to Western governments, and they come up with their own multilateral institution and their own agendas. BCCI, I doubt, had that kind of private philanthropy, doesn't have that kind of normal agenda. So that's a different game. So I in my mind, Orangi is a very classic VO, more of the Gandhian style kind of VO, and you had that historically. You need to revive that culture to the extent possible.
But of course, all the solutions are not going to come through them. Resources are needed. But the thing is, I think development money, I'm not against development money if you could control the use of that money. But when you're so weak that you become subservient to that money and you start losing your own institutions, in fact, in the process, just like I agree, I have a big concern with the universities, the deteriorating capacity of the universities, the research capacity of the universities. Our students are not being trained, to have that kind of research, to do the right level of research, which can be, you lead to right kind of policy and all. While they're very capable, the same people who study in these universities, I was graduate Qaeda Azam at one point. I went to Cambridge, I went to Oxford, all of that. And of course, the training there changed my abilities, but why cannot we bring some of that training back home? It's just that a lot of this donor money, why it, gets exactly channeled to these think tanks. And I personally feel a lot of money does go back to OPM and these kind of institutions, because I work occasionally, do consultancies with them. And exactly, a major chunk of the money is coming back for them to pay all these international consultants. And I'm part of some of those teams at times. So all I'm saying is one knows the system, just like Dr. Nadimullah says, he knows the system because you're part of it. And there are challenges there. I see them. That's
good point. Thank you. Javed Sab, let me come back to you very quickly. Or let me take these two questions that have come up, and these will be the last questions. After that, we'll close. Raza Sab, Raza's iPhone.
Oh, sorry.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम
जी रजा अली साहब, रजा अली साहब फेमस टाउन प्लानर जी, आर्किटेक्ट, बताइए रजा साहब।
जी मैं तो सिर्फ ये कहना चाह रहा हूँ जी कि इस कॉन्वर्सेशन में ऐसा लग रहा है कि जैसे ये कोई नई चीज़ है, फाउंडेशंस आई, आपको तो पता ही है, फोर्ड फाउंडेशन probably was the first that came in early 50s, मतलब mid 50s में, they were well entrenched in Pakistan. So the coming of these foundations is Gates and others is nothing new for us, and we've been through this, number one. Number two, it's also said that I don't know much about USAID's inside workings, but I have worked, beginning as a sort of when we were in England, starting, about 50 years ago. And the Foreign and Commonwealth Office very tightly controlled the flow of not only the use of money, but also the flow of money, and who came in very much was controlled by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So this so-called politicization that is being talked about may have gone into the background for a few years, but was very much part of the agenda of the.
Yeah.
So it was never a thing कि जी वो अब politicize हो गई. Politicize है ही, और है ही political aid to political.
That's why I raised the point earlier. Did we get independence or not?
Well, I don't know whether we did or we didn't, but we certainly never got independent of the foundations. We never got independence from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office or from the State Department.
Fair point. Theek. Fahim Jahangir. Fahim Jahangir is another person who's done some work on aid. He was a panelist on the first aid webinar. So Fahim, can you please tell us? Former PID.
Thank you very much. Very interesting debate. I'm really enjoying that. Thank you, Masuda, for joining us, and Javed Saab. I just wanted to actually just contribute in the debate by showing a slide.
Fahim, come closer to the mic. We can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me now?
Better.
Is it better now? Okay. So I'm just going to share a slide, which is, if the host can allow me to share. I'm still not able to share.
Fahim साहब को share करने दे भाई.
Okay, so let's see. Can you see that?
Okay. Go ahead.
No, this one.
Ji.
So an earlier graph I shared in my presentation last time when I was making my presentation. So this graph actually shows the donors' activities in Pakistan via government and other channels, which include the private channels and NGOs and all other contractors in 2018. So you were asking Javed Saab about the activities of UK in Pakistan. So there it is. In 2018, according to the OECD data, they had 284 activities, and most of those activities were conducted through other channels, including the private sector, and the average size of the disbursement, average project disbursement of DFID was $1.65 million in 2018. And if you look at most of the bilateral donors, you will see they actually enjoy to work with the partner organizations or local development partners, or you call the NGOs or other organizations. And as Masouda was mentioning, that around 30% of the total aid goes to the private sector channel. I remember Hina Rabbani Khar talking to the audience at the Pakistan Development Forum in 2010. I don't have the recent numbers. At that time, she quoted the number 53% of the aid. 53% of the aid was channeling through the private sector, outside the government sector in Pakistan. So there are numerous development partners operating in Pakistan, and they are actually executing donors' agenda in the country. And they are doing so because these partner organizations or NGOs, they do not and they will not get any fund from the donors until and unless they have their operations and activities in line with the donor's country strategy program. So if a donor is willing to invest in some project on women empowerment, and if NGO doesn't have women empowerment in its agenda, they will not fund that NGO. So that's how it works. And when for my research, I was trying to, get the numbers, the exact numbers of these NGOs operating in Pakistan. I was unable to get the exact numbers of active NGOs. And my question here would be like to, with these donors, and yes, if you try to register these donors, whenever the government tries to register these active donors in Pakistan, that bilateral and multilateral donors will come forward and resist. They will take part in resisting this campaign to register. So my question is how to make them more accountable, in a sense, to make aid more effective in Pakistan.
Good point, very good point. Javed sir, let me come back to you, but let me, Javed sir, एक छोटी सी बात बीच में कर दूं. आपने कहा था, you said that civil service reform. I'll tell you, when I was in the Planning Commission, I made civil service reform central to the framework of economic growth. You'll remember that. The reaction of the World Bank Vice President at that time, Isabella, I'll even name her, and DFID. I'll even name your guy, the Pakistani guy, Sikandar, who was there, right? These guys was, no, we don't want a civil service reform. And they sided with the civil service, saying we shouldn't have a reform. Secondly, they also determined, for example, they determine whether there should be a demand for civil service reform or not. They'll come in with their capacity development projects. They'll come in with their projects, which will reduce the demand for capacity. When you say hire a consultant from outside without a civil service reform, you know we can't hire a consultant from outside, right? And at the same time, what donors will say, hey, we can't have a civil service reform. You can't hire a person from outside. We'll put in PEPRA rules now. Now, PEPRA rules have made it even more difficult for us to do anything at all, because we are supposed to be the corrupt guys, whereas PEPRA rules don't apply in the donor organizations. They will not allow our universities to compete. Now, tell me, we are being dumped upon in our own country. Javed sir, please tell me, how do you square the circle here?
First thing I think you have access to kind of, Pakistani decision-making structures. It's actually quite easy to make donors to really ask them to only allow Pakistani universities and Pakistani firms to build. It's not difficult, to be honest. If it is made part of EAD, meet every second month to every donor. And there's a partnership agreement, and donors cannot work without EAD partnership agreement. There are clauses in it. Very easily, Pakistani parliamentary committees, Pakistani politicians, policymakers, and I would welcome that. I've never lived abroad, actually. All my life is spent here, and very happy to work with you and others. I mean, it's really not a big problem. In terms of accountability,
we'll take your
Dr. Dr. Fahim, accountability. Pakistan established a great organization called Pakistan Center for Philanthropy 15 years ago, and its actually mandate is to certify every international and local NGO, and they have a very comprehensive 6-month process to do that. The problem is that Pakistani state didn't really give it a teeth. I mean, they just gave them a very loose mandate. They can very easily make it mandatory for PCP to go and actually look at every aspect, even value for money, even all of these aspects of international versus local staff, even around, making them to align with Pakistani development priorities. They can actually do that. And I'm actually fail to understand why they don't do it, because even international NGOs are lobbying to the government that they should make PCP a central organization to do that. The reason is now government have asked Ministry of Interior to regulate international NGOs, and Ministry of Interior only look at NGOs from the standpoint of security, and they don't have capability, don't have economists or others who actually look at these institutions professionally. They have only law enforcement bodies. And that's not even helpful for Pakistan also, because you don't have real data analysis capacity and others. PCP, on the other hand, have experience of working in the sector for the last 15, 20 years. They've done it with thousands of organizations of data. They can analyze it. They're very professional. And just by one notification in which, for example, government make it conditional that PCP, if it doesn't certify an INGO or local NGO, it won't be able to have fund. This problem can be solved in 1 week. So that's. The third bit is you mentioned that why NGOs have their own agenda. Look, NGOs are also very different. Many are formed by individuals. They have their own mandate or interest. They want to work on a particular issue. They come to a country. They say, oh, we would work on only child development or only water others. And, they then make it conditional that in order to deliver project, that should be, so that's like kind of a social enterprise, how it works. And that's how the market conditions are. But if, for example, we do our job well, they could do better. Just I'll give you one example that when I was working in Punjab, not even once I was summoned by Punjab Assembly's Education Committee to come and talk about my portfolio. I reached out to Muslim League myself and asked Mashood that I want to present to Muslim League Parliamentary Committee that what reforms we are trying to do. And he gave me some time. The point is that, the real scrutiny should come from the parliament, because they have the mandate and they have the authority. Parliamentary committees, in the provincial level, also parliamentary committees, they should be able to scrutinize it. Last one, Dr. Nadeem, is that, human rights are part of our fundamental rights in Pakistan since 1973 Constitution, and we should work on it on our own. Why should other countries ask us to work on that? But for the last many years, the National Commission for Human Rights is vacant, position is vacant, no budget is given to them, provincial commissions are vacant. So the local human rights infrastructure which Pakistani state should actually equip and give money and equip with the officials and people is dysfunctional. And then international community comes in to say, oh, you should work on women or work on disability others. And then we say why they're objecting to it. The problem is that, we are almost like, the indicators aside, but Dr. Adil Najam says that if you live in Islamabad, it's like living in Spain or something. So you have almost a middle class life and middle class culture in Pakistan. Even then, we kind of, the state operators work like the way we are working in East Africa. There's a very weak capacity, and we should put our acts together to make it work for us. Not just for 10% of the aid money, by the way, the 90% of the rest of the budget money also, which is Pakistani taxpayers' money, and we should do our job well to kind of, spend that.
Thank you, Javed sir. Very good. Masouda Bibi, I'll give you the last word. On human rights, I think US needs human rights too, but nobody tells it to have a human rights committee, but we do. But my question to you, Masouda, would be, apart from whatever else you might want to say, can we move ahead without a civil service reform?
हर चीज सियासी नहीं है, ये मैं बात उसकी कह रहा हूँ जो थाने कचहरी के मसले हैं, गांव देहात के लोगों के मसले हैं, हर चीज को आप एक इंटरनेशनल सिक्योरिटी का वो एंगल ना दें, ये पूरे का पूरा एक बिल्कुल डिफरेंट नैरेटिव आप बना रहे हैं, वो मैं नहीं समझता ये प्लीज.
Fair point. Let's ask Masouda to have the last word. Masouda, baby, go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, what do I have to say? Like a lot of, I think all the useful things have been said, and the positions I think are also coming out clearly. That there's one which is I think mine, and one shouldn't attribute positions to somebody else, but I think mine and Dr. Haq's is a bit closer, which is a bit more cynical of the aid and the agenda it comes with, and one thing is the agenda, and the other thing is I actually really feel the ability that the fact that it's 10% of aid, but it influences almost 90% of our policy. This, Javed, the figure you give us is in fact the worrying thing, that the little money they have, the system is such, if maybe it's weak capacity or whatever you blame it, that they end up influencing the 90% as well, a very heavy part of it. So that's a big concern actually for me. And it's established concern actually in the literature too, not just in Pakistan, but in many countries, donors are able to outweigh the actual money they put in and influence the country policy. So all of these are concerns. We need to do something about it, and answers. And I found, by the way, Fahim, your slide very useful. It's good that you've been compiling this kind of data, but the whole thing is way forward. Let's focus on that. And as always, it's easier to criticize than to find answers or solutions, what to do forward. I do personally, I think on the NGO bit, I'm a bit concerned that maybe it's getting a bit too heavily regulated, especially with the Interior Ministry and all of those things coming in. So I am with Javed that maybe PCP and these kind of organizations which can test more the substantive quality of the work they're doing should be monitoring them, not necessarily monitoring, I mean regulating them rather than Interior Ministry doing it. So we shouldn't, we should create space for organic kind of participation, and these kind of laws can stifle all kind of participation. So I'm a bit concerned about that. But as for aid in general, to be honest, I'm one of those who have seen it long enough. When I finished my book, I must say, and if you read the preface to the book, I say that after finishing the book and all of that, I've done some more work, and I'm a bit more optimistic again that maybe, given that resources are limited, developing countries can stay engaged with it and use it more effectively. Because I was very cynical by the end of the research I'd done in Pakistan, which was actually for my doctorate thesis, which became a book that you mentioned. But actually, in the long term, I've again become very cynical, and it's not to say that, because I was part of a wonderful project on the whole, just like the Javed's experience in Punjab, that you feel very positive about what was done in that education sector. You were involved, you saw it. I was part of a similar kind of, like I said, program in northern Nigeria, across the whole, and northern Nigeria in particular. Apparently, good things were happening. My model was so useful. Children in Quranic schools were suddenly learning because of my intervention. I adapted some of these things and introduced modern subjects to them. But in the long term, did it achieve anything? I would say nothing. We just distracted the energy of the bureaucrats because there was a lot of corruption in the system. We could incentivize them to cooperate because of this big money given to them, per diems, all of that. By the end, the energy was wasted. Our energy was wasted. I don't think anything was achieved long term. So frankly, I'm not the best person to say what can be done with it. I'm just cynical of it. I do feel that internal reform has to happen, whether it's civil service reform or how to build your state capacity is the ultimate question, and how to build political will. I must say, I was a bit hopeful that with Imran Khan in power, my political affiliations come out. I was a bit, we thought that at least the political will issue might be solved, as opposed to the previous politician. Here is a man, I'm committed, I'm at least sure of his commitment to reform. But again, one individual person will isn't enough. You need political elites to have and invest. In fact, I'll finish with that. This literature on political settlements, where it's an obvious point, but the point is that unless your political elites have the incentives to reform, you're unlikely to bring any kind of change. Any kind of donor money can come to you. They'll use that money for their incentives rather than a reform. So how do we go back to the classic challenges, which is how to build your political will and how to have an efficient civil service to deliver it. And I think in Pakistani context, I don't know how much you're willing to touch the military, but the fact that military is heavily involved in governance, all these three actors, reform lies with them, not with development agencies. That's what I would say. I'm finished.
Thank you very much, Masooda. Thank you very much, Javed Saab. I have nothing much to add. I think all made some very good points. Javed Saab, I agree with you entirely that the fault lies with us and we have to wake up. But as large amount of literature shows that what matters really is your own ideas, your own knowledge. Development is all about knowledge gathering. It's not about machines. It's not about anything. My classmate Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize last year for saying that. It is an idea business, and we have to be in the idea business, where they were far too clever, going back to the 1950s cartoon. They realized if they make us idea dependent, through money dependence, we will remain in there. Now, this sounds like a conspiracy. I don't mean it to sound like a conspiracy. Let's go back to the Diary of the Economic Hitman. I used to think it's a joke, but it seems now that it's a reality. It doesn't have to be that somebody is manipulating the system, but that's the way the system works out. But it's not a conspiracy. It's our own incapacity to make reform. And our own capacity to make reform ties in with our own incapacity to generate ideas, which is why I'm interested in universities. Let me just say this. When I came back from my studies, everybody was going to local university. That is the only form of employment. All of us went and got lecturer positions in all Pakistani universities. Those same people gradually migrated to NGOs,
Exactly.
from there to international positions like myself, from
Exactly.
there back to NGOs. And unless we begin to understand that, and this is what I keep writing about, unless we begin to understand that the game is a talent game, and we harness our own talent instead of letting people like Masouda, Atif Mia, etc. go overseas, harness them at home. US takes our best talents and makes it develop. And US gives us, this is the paper again that Ali Khan and I did in 97. It's available on the website. We have shown properly through any theoretical means that you like, mathematically, etc., that the best talent does not render itself available for aid. Only the second-rate talent comes into aid. The best talent remains in entrepreneurial activities. This is another thing that was proven by Baumel too. So we won't go there. We'll take up this session again sometime. Thank you very much, Masouda. Thank you very much, Javed. Thank you very much, everybody. Please stay with us on our learning journey. We are trying to ask tough questions and learn. When we say something, please don't take it as an opinion. It's a question because we are trying to learn. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
All very accessible. Thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you. I really enjoyed being part of it. And Javed, thanks for the good comments.
Thank you. That was great.